Hey guys, tonight, before we go anywhere, I want you to do something unusual. I want you to think about someone who saved a family, changed a story, and then disappeared so completely from the historical record that even the people who loved that story for 100 years barely know his real name. Not because he was unimportant, because the people writing history decided he was. That is where we begin tonight. Dakota Territory, summer of 1879. It was not a territory in any settled sense of the word. It was a construction zone. Along the route of the Chicago and Northwestern's Dakota Central extension, crews of several hundred men had cut a railroad grade through prairie soil that had never been broken before. The grass ran tall enough to obscure a standing horse. The sky pressed down wide and flat in every direction. The air carried the smell of turned earth, wood smoke, and animal work, and something sharper underneath, the particular smell of a place where men are living right at the edge of what they can survive. This was Silver Lake Camp. This was the end of the line for the Dakota Central, pushing west through a territory that most people back east still thought of as empty. It was not empty. It had never been empty. But that was a truth the railroad and the newspapers and the government had been working hard to erase, 1 mile of track at a time. There were hundreds of men here, Irish navvies who had been following the rails west for years, their hands calloused down to something that barely resembles skin anymore. Scandinavian immigrants who came to America with nothing and took this work because it was the only work that did not require you to speak English well. Mixed heritage men who moved between worlds because no single world would fully claim them. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, riding a white horse, carrying every rumour the camp had ever invented about him, was the man they called Big Jerry. Nobody called him by his real name. That is the first thing you need to understand about this story. Not because it is a small detail, because it is the whole story. His nickname was not a term of affection. It was a reduction. It is the thing you call a man when you have decided that his full humanity is more than you are prepared to acknowledge. And on this particular summer night in 1879, a group of men in this camp had decided they were going to kill him. They believed he was a horse thief. They could not prove it. But belief has never needed proof on a railroad frontier, and the particular hatred they carried for a man described as half French and half Native American. A man who gambled and won more often than made his co-workers comfortable. A man who kept to himself in a way that looked to frightened people like contempt. That kind of hatred finds its evidence in the wanting. They were waiting in the dark with rifles. Inside a drafty camp building not far from where those men crouched, a 12-year-old girl named Laura Ingalls was awake in the dark with her mother. Her father, Charles Ingalls, worked for the railroad. He knew Big Jerry. He was, by the account Laura would later write, one of the few men in that camp who extended the man ordinary human decency. And that night Pa was somewhere out there. The men with rifles were somewhere in that darkness. And Laura and her mother were listening for the sound of something going terribly wrong. This is the story as Laura Ingalls Wilder told it. But here is the thing about stories. They have two shapes. The shape they take when someone writes them down, and the shape they had before the writing happened, when they were still just a life being lived by real people who had no idea they would one day become literature. Tonight, we are going to find the second shape. To understand who Big Jerry was, you first have to understand what the Dakota Central Railroad actually was in 1879, not the railroad of romance, not the golden spike ceremonies and the speeches about manifest destiny and the neat lines on a map that made the continent look like it had always been waiting to be connected. The actual railroad, the one that existed in the mud and the cold. The Chicago and Northwestern's Dakota Central line was pushing west from Tracy, Minnesota, a town established as a railroad hub, named in honor of a director of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Company, and by the spring of 1879, the staging point for the extension westward into Dakota Territory. Crews were moving fast. The economic pressure was enormous. The railroad held land grants tied to completed mileage, which meant that slower construction literally cost the company money it had already been promised. Men were worked hard and paid inconsistently. And the communities they built, the end-of-line camps that followed the advancing railhead, were rough in the particular way of places that exist only to be abandoned. You did not build a home at an end-of-line camp. You built a structure that the company could tear down when the track moved west and the camp moved with it. You slept in it and ate in it and maybe drank in it, and then you packed what you owned and followed the steel. The men who did this work were overwhelmingly immigrant and working class. The Irish navvies who built American railroads left a paper trail. Newspapers complained about them. Unions organised around them. Politicians used them as examples of what the country was becoming. The mixed heritage men who worked beside them, the men who had French-Canadian fathers and Ojibwe or Lakota mothers, the men who moved through two cultures and were fully claimed by neither. Those men are harder to find in the archive. They left nicknames. They left rumours. They left the impression they made on other people's memories. That is the world that produced Big Jerry. The research synthesizing the Pioneer Girl Project's archival work, records from the National Archives, and the annotated Pioneer Girl volume identifies Big Jerry most specifically as connected to the family of Frederick William Fields, the railroad overseer who managed grading crews along the Dakota Central through Kingsbury County, and who was said to often eat his meals at the surveyor's house with the Ingalls family. Fred Fields was born in Canada in 1843. His wife, Almina, born Marguerite Almina Bressud in December 1854, also in Canada, came from a French heritage family. And in Laura Ingalls Wilder's own words, Big Jerry was Fred Fields' brother-in-law. What the archive has not resolved is the precise direction of that relationship. Fred was either married to Big Jerry's sister, or Big Jerry was married to Fred's sister. The two men were connected by marriage. The specific line runs cold after that. That uncertainty is not incidental to this story. It is central to it. The current working hypothesis, developed by researchers examining census records and family documents, is that Big Jerry may have been Almina's brother, a figure recorded as Eugene in an 1860 census in Burlington, Vermont, when the Bressord family appears in that record. Researcher Nancy Cleaveland has pointed to a naming pattern in the Fields family as possible evidence. In 1877, Almina gave birth to a son named Eugene Joseph Fields. On his World War I draft registration, that same son's name is listed as Jerry Joseph Fields. If the family carried both names, Eugene and Jerry, across generations, it may reflect a family tradition rooted in the man the camp knew only by his nickname. The physical descriptions in the Fields family's draft records are consistent with Wilder's account of Big Jerry as physically imposing, dark-complexioned, and strongly built. But the archive has not produced a birth certificate, a death record, a land filing, or a wage entry that clearly names the man behind the nickname. You can find Fred Fields. You can trace his movements from Canada to the Dakota Central line, to a homestead in Turner County filed in March 1878, to Mitchell, South Dakota, to Montebello, California, where he died on November 20th, 1933, and where Almina followed him on June 17th, 1935. You cannot find Big Jerry in anything official, which means the only place you can find him, the only record that preserves his existence with any detail at all, is in the memory of a 12-year-old girl who watched him with the kind of attention that only children and writers sustain, and who later became both, and who, in writing it down, changed it. Laura Elizabeth Ingalls was born on February 7, 1867, near Pepin, Wisconsin, in the log cabin her father built in the Big Woods region, 7 miles north of the village of Pepin, near the shore of Lake Pepin. By the time she was 12, she had already lived in more places than most adults of the era. Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, back to Wisconsin, and now the Dakota Territory that her father's restlessness had carried them to. Charles Ingalls took the job at Silver Lake Camp through his connection with Fred Fields because the family needed money. The particular genteel poverty of the Ingalls, too proud to take charity, too unlucky to hold on to what they built, is the backdrop against which everything in Laura's childhood was lived. Pa worked for the railroad not because he loved it. He worked because it was paying. And the job came with an arrangement. The family, including Ma and the girls, would come to Silver Lake Camp and keep house for the surveying crew, which gave the camp a domesticity it would not otherwise have had. That is how 12-year-old Laura Ingalls ended up in the middle of a railroad construction camp on the Dakota Prairie, nay, and watching the world her father had brought her to from the inside of it. She watched everything. That quality, the precise, unblinking attention she turned on everything around her, is visible in every page she ever wrote. She noticed the way the prairie light moved in the morning. She noticed the smell of the camp. She noticed the men her father worked with. And she noticed the man on the white horse. She was 12 years old. She would not write about this for another 50 years. By the time she did, in the early 1930s, working at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, where she and Al Manzo had built their life, she was in her 60s, and the rough, uncomfortable truth of Silver Lake Camp had been sanded down by time and by the practical demands of writing. The manuscript she produced, titled Pioneer Girl, was an adult autobiography. Publishers who received it through her daughter Rose Wilder Lane found the material episodic, in places too raw, and not suited to the market. Pioneer Girl did not find a publisher, not for 84 years. The annotated edition was finally published in 2014 by the South Dakota Historical Society Press. What happened instead was a reworking of the material into children's fiction. The Little House books, published by Harper between 1932 and 1943, drew from the same source but shaped it differently. The editorial process involved substantial input from Rose Wilder Lane, a professional writer of considerable experience and, by the early 1930s, a committed libertarian thinker whose political convictions shaped how she understood the frontier story and what it should be allowed to say. It's just... The Big Jerry, who appears in By the Shores of Silver Lake, published in 1939, is a different figure from the one in the Pioneer Girl manuscript. In the novel, he's given a climactic function. A stranger threatens Pa on the road, and Big Jerry intervenes. The scene resolves the threat and assigns Big Jerry a heroic role, dangerous enough to be interesting, protective enough to be acceptable. He becomes the good version of the racial other, the mixed heritage man who uses his access to violence on behalf of the white family, who protects the people the story has already established as the ones worth protecting. And then, having served that function, he disappears from the narrative. Carolyn Fraser, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography Prairie Fires, drawing on the Pioneer Girl Project's archival research, and states the conclusion plainly. There is no record of the real Big Jerry performing any of these feats. The archival record does not support the gunman scene as Laura described it. The dramatic labour unrest depicted in the Silver Lake narrative, a near riot that Big Jerry supposedly diffuses by leading troublemakers away, has no corroboration near De Smet. Researchers at the Pioneer Girl Project have traced that episode to a documented riot at Tracy, Minnesota in mid-June 1879. Workers were demanding an increase in pay, from $1.25 per day for men and $2.50 for teams to $1.50 and $3. The situation escalated. The governor received a telegram requesting militia. That riot happened. It happened at Tracy, where Charles Ingalls and the other future De Smet residents would have been fully aware of it. In the novel, it was relocated and assigned a resolution, centred on Big Jerry, that the historical record does not provide. This matters not because it diminishes the books. They are what they are, and what they are has reached tens of millions of readers across nearly a century. It matters because of what the transformation did to the man at the centre of it. The editorial process that moved Pioneer Girl into the published novel adjusted the rougher material, the specific texture of camp hostility toward a mixed heritage man, the harder edges of his actual social position, to fit what the children's publishing market of the 1930s required. The result is a character who is vivid and memorable and shaped entirely to serve a story that was never entirely his. Before we go further, I want you to hold a question, not answer it yet. Just hold it. If Big Jerry really did protect Pa Ingalls, not in the heroic, novelised way, but in some ordinary human way, the kind of protection that comes from one person choosing to treat another person as worth defending, then why was that story so thoroughly erased from the historical record? And if he did not, If the dramatic scene in the book is a story Laura and Rose built from pieces of other things, a real labour riot relocated from Tracy, a real man whose actual life was messier and harder and less cinematically satisfying than fiction required, then what does it mean that for nearly 100 years, readers believed it? What does it mean that the most vivid documentation of this man's existence is a version of him that was never entirely true? We are going to come back to that, I promise you. But first, we need to walk the ground of 1879 and understand the world that Big Jerry was actually living in before we can understand what Laura's books did to it. Big Jerry's name was not Big Jerry. The archive has not yet recovered what his name actually was. The research that might recover it is ongoing. Settle in. The lights are low. The prairie is wide and dark. The wind in the grass sounds like something breathing. But before we walk into that camp, you need to know what they were actually planning to do to him, and why nobody stopped them. The grass is still moving. That is the first thing you need to understand about this world. Everything moves. The prairie is never still. Even on a calm night with no storm in sight, the tall blue stem and switchgrass rolls in slow, continuous waves. And if you have only ever known cities and fences and managed land, it does the strangest thing to you. It makes you feel like the ground itself is breathing. Like the earth under your boots is something alive and you are a small, temporary thing standing on top of it with no particular permission. Charles Ingalls understood that feeling better than almost anyone. He had been chasing this horizon his whole adult life, Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota, and now, in the spring and summer of 1879, west again into a territory that was not yet a state, barely even a coherent idea, drawn forward by the same thing that had always drawn him. The promise that the next place would be the one that finally held, but this time was different. This time, Charles Ingalls arrived at Silver Lake Camp not as a homesteader riding into open country with a wagon and a prayer. He arrived as an employee. He had secured a position as storekeeper and timekeeper through Frederick William Fields, the railroad overseer managing the grading crews on the Dakota Central Extension, a role that came with a regular wage, a company house, and a place just slightly above the mass of ordinary labourers who built the grade each day with their hands and their backs and their complete exhaustion. That position matters. It matters enormously, because it means that when Laura watched Big Jerry ride across the camp on his white horse, she was watching him from a particular vantage point, not from below, not from the level of the navvies who dug alongside him, but from the family that ate with the foreman. The family whose father kept the books. That line cut directly through Big Jerry. Most people, when they picture a railroad camp in 1879, picture something out of a western. Tents, fire, men on horses, drama with a capital D. The reality was closer to a small, temporary factory town dropped onto the prairie without warning, expected to function at full capacity, and then picked up and moved 30 miles west when the track advanced. The Dakota Central camps had bunkhouses, long, low structures built from rough-cut lumber arriving on supply trains, smelling permanently of fresh pine sap and the sweat of men sleeping 12 and 16 to a room in stacked bunks along the walls. Floors were bare boards, windows, where there were windows, were small and didn't open easily. In summer, the heat built inside those buildings through the afternoon until sleeping became a transaction. You were tired enough, or you weren't. A cook shanty provided meals before dawn and after dark. Lunch was carried out to the grade in tin pails. These were not communities built for leisure or permanence. They were built to advance with the track and be abandoned the moment the railhead moved west. And then there was the question of what happened after dinner. In a camp with no town within reasonable distance, no church, no families, because most of the men had no families with them, the evening hours produced their own pressures. Men with wages in their pockets and no organised alternatives spent those hours in ways that were economically and socially volatile. Gambling was one of them. Oh, this is where Big Jerry enters the picture with full weight. In Laura's account, both in the Pioneer Girl manuscript she wrote as an adult in 1930 and in the 1939 children's novel By the Shores of Silver Lake, Big Jerry is introduced as a gambler, not casually, meaningfully. The gambling is the first significant fact the camp establishes about him, appearing before the horse theft rumours, Before the red shirt and the white horse and the striking physical presence that makes a 12-year-old girl stop and look twice, he played cards. He won consistently. In a community built on shared economic precarity, consistent winning was not a neutral achievement. It announced a kind of advantage that men who were losing found difficult to accept and difficult to forgive. Big Jerry was also carrying what the camp's racial framework had already assigned him before he ever dealt a single hand. He was of mixed French and Indigenous ancestry, half from the French-Canadian fur trade families who had been in the region for generations, half from the indigenous nations whose lands the railroad was actively displacing. In the racial thinking of 1879 Dakota Territory, that combination placed him outside every category the camp knew how to process cleanly. He was not classified as white. He was not fully indigenous by the terms the camp applied to that category either. He occupied an intermediate space that the social hierarchy of a railroad construction camp could not accommodate without friction. The response, as it almost always was rumour. Camp gossip said that whenever Big Jerry appeared, the best horses in the area disappeared shortly after. The Pioneer Girl Project's archival research, cross-referenced against regional records, finds no historical documentation tying any Fields family relative or mixed heritage worker to horse theft convictions in Dakota Territory in 1879 or 1880. In Laura's own account, the accusation is presented explicitly as hearsay, something Pa doubts and refuses to act on. But in a camp running on fear and proximity, unverified suspicion attached to a man who had already been designated as threatening carried the same social weight as evidence. It always did. That is how that particular machinery works. There was also something the white workers noticed and resented, and could not articulate cleanly, because articulating it would have required them to acknowledge something about themselves. Yeah, they preferred not to see. Big Jerry moved through the camp with an unhurried authority that had nothing to do with company rank, because rank was something the railroad gave you, and what Big Jerry had was older than the railroad. It was the particular competence of a man who had grown up knowing the land he was now being paid to tear up. That kind of competence, in a camp full of tired men with rifles within reach, was its own kind of provocation. You cannot understand Big Jerry without understanding Fred Fields. Frederick William Fields was born in Canada in December 1843. By 1879 he had arrived in Dakota Territory as a railroad overseer, responsible for managing the grading crews on the Dakota Central Extension, the structural middle of the camp's hierarchy. Translating the railroad company's production demands into daily work orders, managing the conflicts that erupted between men living and working in tight, exhausted proximity. He had married Marguerite Almina Bressord in New York in June 1870. Almina was Canadian-born from a French heritage family, and she and Fred would eventually have 13 surviving children. Pioneer Girl Project researchers, working from census records, homestead filings, and draft registrations, identify Almina's family as the probable kin connection through which Big Jerry was present in the camp. He was Fred Fields' brother-in-law, connected by marriage in a direction the archive has not fully resolved, but connected. Fred Fields ate with the Ingalls family at the surveyor's house. He was part of the domestic circle that Charles and Caroline presided over in the middle of a camp that had no other domestic circle, and he was sometimes accompanied by Big Jerry. Think about what that means. Big Jerry had access to the social centre of the camp not through the workers who feared him, but through the foreman whose family he was connected to. He was not simply an outsider. He was treated as an outsider by the men who feared him, but he was an insider in ways the camp's racial anxiety desperately needed to erase. A mixed heritage man with genuine social standing at the management level was a category error too threatening to process with honesty. So, the camp processed him the other way. It made him a gambler, a rumoured thief, an unpredictable presence who arrived on a white horse and disappeared when the inconvenient parts of his story got too heavy. That was safer. That was the shape the camp could live with. One detail from Laura's account works against every story the camp told about him. Old Johnny was an elderly Irish water carrier, given lighter duties because he was no longer capable of the heavy work of grading. Too old for productive labour, retained in a marginal role, without the wages or position that might have guaranteed him care when he needed it. He fell ill. Nobody attended to him. Big Jerry sat up through the cold night and tended him, fed him, kept him warm until morning. The research confirms this detail appears in both the Pioneer Girl manuscript and the published novel. Pa's response is recorded. He couldn't take better care of his own father than he did of old Johnny. For that matter, Carolyn, I don't know but what we're beholden to him ourselves. The Irish navvies who built the Dakota Central occupied the lowest functional tier of the camp's social world. Catholic in a Protestant-dominant culture, immigrant in a country that depended on immigrant labour while publicly resenting it. Old Johnny was at the bottom of that tier, and Big Jerry, the man the camp had designated as the most dangerous person in it, was the one who chose, without audience or obligation, to care for the most vulnerable person in it, not toward the powerful, in the other direction entirely. Whatever else was true of this man, that choice tells you something about who he was when no one was telling him who he was supposed to be. Here is something the children's book smooths over so thoroughly that most readers never notice it is there at all. The men who built the Dakota Central Railroad were angry. In mid-June 1879, Pioneer Girl Project researchers date the disturbance to mid-June 1879, workers on the railroad at Tracy, Minnesota, rioted over wages and conditions. They were demanding an increase in pay, from $1.25 per day for men and $2.50 for teams, to $1.50 and $3. The governor of Minnesota received a telegram requesting militia. County Sheriff J.A. Hunter was involved in managing the escalation. The St. Paul Globe reported on the events. Tracy was the eastern terminus of the Dakota Central Line. The starting point of the same westward extension Charles Ingalls was working on. The men who rioted at Tracy were drawn from the same labour pool as the men at Silver Lake. Same grievances, same wages, same corporate management, and by the shores of Silver Lake the riot moves west. It becomes a near riot at Silver Lake, a threat that Big Jerry resolves by leading the dangerous men away from camp before violence reaches the Ingalls family. Pa trusts him. The family is safe. The confrontation dissolves off stage. The Pioneer Girl Project finds no historical record of any such riot near De Smet in 1879. What the novel's version accomplishes is a quiet act of erasure, a documented corporate labour conflict driven by specific economic grievances from organised workers who were being systematically underpaid, becomes a piece of frontier disorder attributed to individual temperament. Big Jerry absorbs the energy of a workforce with legitimate demands and carries it away from the white family at the centre of the story. The rational economic content of the Tracy riot disappears. What remains is a man on a horse, a threat that is personal rather than systemic, and a resolution that depends on one man's character rather than on the conditions that made the anger necessary in the first place. That is a heavy thing to ask of one man's nickname. But here is what makes this story more than a critique. Here is the thing that keeps pulling you back toward the campfire. Charles Ingalls believed in Big Jerry, not in the hero story version, not in the romantic mythology, in the specific daily, human way of believing in someone you have watched at close range and decided to trust when most of the people around you have decided otherwise. Pa doubted the horse theft rumours. He extended a decency that the camp's racial economy did not require him to extend, and he said so out loud in his own house, in front of his wife who did not share his opinion, and Laura, watching her father, absorbed all of it. She carried it with her for 50 years. She put it on the page. The version she put on the page was imperfect. The labour conflict was relocated. The heroic scene has no support in the archival record. The rougher texture of camp hostility was handed down by the editorial process and by the requirements of Harper's Children's List and by Rose Wilder Lane's particular sense of what the frontier story should be allowed to say. But underneath all of that, and underneath the myth-making and the editorial smoothing and the deliberate relocation of uncomfortable facts, there was a real relationship, a real man on a real white horse moving through a real camp, carrying real rumours, being seen by a real 12-year-old girl who thought he was worth remembering, imperfectly seen, inadequately recorded, but genuinely registered. That is not nothing. That is in fact the most important thing in this entire story. We know what the camp looked like, we know the hierarchy it ran on, we know the Irish navies and the cook shanty and the wages that weren't always paid and the gambling and the rumours and where Fred Fields fit and where Charles Ingalls fit. But here is what we do not know. Here is the open wound at the centre of this story. We do not know what Big Jerry thought about any of it. We do not know whether he knew men were planning to shoot him in that camp, or whether he was used to threats so routine they had stopped registering. We do not know whether the rumour about the horses enraged him, or amused him, or simply exhausted him, the way unjust things exhaust people who have been living with them their whole lives. We do not know what he felt about the 12-year-old girl who watched him from her father's doorway, who stored the image of him for 50 years and then, imperfectly, lovingly, imprecisely, put him in a book. We do not know if he ever read it. We do not know if his family did. Those absences are not accidents. They are the shape of what this story was designed to erase, and in the chapters ahead, we are going to get as close as the surviving record will allow us to get. The Pioneer Girl Project's archival research has traced what can be traced. Fred and Almina Fields are documented into their California years. Among their children, a son named Eugene Joseph Fields appears on a World War I draft card under the name Jerry Joseph Fields, a naming pattern that researcher Nancy Cleaveland identifies as potentially carrying both names across 2 generations of the same family and therefore possibly back to the man Laura called Big Jerry. His legal identity has not been confirmed. No census entry, no land record, no death certificate has yet been found that clearly names him. The archive holds the Fields family in considerable detail and holds Big Jerry in almost none. What survives of him exists almost entirely within someone else's account of a childhood he was present for, and that was never written about him. He appeared in the margins. He was recorded in a nickname. He was given a role that fit a story rather than a life. The fire in the camp is burning low. The men who planned to shoot Big Jerry have either gone to their bunks or they haven't. The white horse is still out there somewhere on the black prairie, moving through grass that sounds like something breathing. Because the scene in the book that made Big Jerry a hero, it never happened. And the scene that did happen, the one Laura buried in her original manuscript, is far darker than anything Harper Brothers would publish. There is a version of this story that is very clean. It lives on a shelf in a library. It has a coloured cloth cover, a girl in a bonnet on the front, and that particular faint vanilla smell of paper that has been through many hands. You probably know what that smell means. If you're watching this, there is a good chance you know it from childhood. From a bedroom floor or a grandmother's lap, or the particular quiet of an afternoon when you had nowhere to be and nothing to do but follow a girl named Laura across a prairie that felt, on the page, like it went on forever. That version is beautiful. It is genuinely, honestly beautiful. But it is not the first version. The first version was written by a 63-year-old woman in pencil on cheap-lined school tablets at a farmhouse in Missouri in 1930. It was rougher. It was darker. It included people who got left out of the final books, situations that made publishers uneasy, and a portrait of frontier life that was honest in ways that children's publishing in 1930 had no framework for handling. The publishers who read that manuscript told her the same thing in different ways. It was too much. This chapter is about what that meant for Big Jerry. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down to write Pioneer Girl, not for children, but for adults. An honest memoir, written in the voice of a woman looking backward across 60 years with clear eyes and enough distance to tell the truth about what she had seen. She submitted it to publishers in New York through Rose Wilder Lane, her daughter, who was already a professional writer with the contacts and industry knowledge Laura did not have. The responses came back with the same essential message. The material was too episodic, too dark in places, too frank about poverty, violence, and the harder edges of frontier life that the American public in 1930 preferred to mythologize rather than confront. Pioneer Girl did not find a publisher. Not in its original form, not as an adult memoir, not for 84 years, until the South Dakota Historical Society Press published the annotated edition on November 17, 2014, edited by Pamela Smith Hill with Nancy Tistad Kopal as project director. It became a New York Times bestseller. The public, it turned out, had been waiting for the real version for a long time. What happened in the intervening decades was the reconstruction of that raw material into children's fiction. Rose Wilder Lane, a professional writer with a working knowledge of editorial markets and narrative architecture that her mother did not have in the same way, worked with Laura to reshape the Pioneer Girl material into the Little House series, 8 books, published by Harper between 1932 and 1943. Drawn from the same source but shaped differently. The transformation was not simply a matter of removing the darkest material, it was a reframing. Events that in Pioneer Girl carry the texture of complicated lived experience were restructured in the children's novels to move through Laura's child perspective in a way that made every difficulty ultimately meaningful, every danger ultimately resolved, and the frontier ultimately legible as a place where the right virtues produced the right outcomes. That restructuring required decisions about every character whose presence created narrative complications. Big Jerry required decisions, in By the Shores of Silver Lake, published by Harper in 1939, the first time the reader encounters Big Jerry is through Laura's eyes. And Laura's eyes, at 12, see something the adult world of the camp has already made up its mind about. He comes in on a white horse, wearing a red shirt so vivid it reads as a statement, something that wants to be seen in a landscape where most things are the brown and grey of working men and working days. He is large, he is striking. He has the particular physical presence of someone who occupies space without apologising for it. The novel describes him as a half-breed, half French, half Indian, in the language of 1879 and the language of 1939. Well, because neither world had yet developed the framework or the will to call that combination anything else. Before Laura has formed her own view of him, the camp has already formed one. He arrives pre-narrated, gambler, trouble. When Jerry's in camp, watch your horses. Pa doubts this story. Pa extends to Big Jerry a basic human recognition that the camp's consensus does not require. And Laura, watching her father, learns something about how to look at a person, not at the story the crowd has attached to that person, but at the person themselves. That dynamic is rooted in something the evidence supports. Charles Ingalls knew the man behind Big Jerry through Fred Fields, the railroad overseer who ate with the Ingalls family and was sometimes accompanied by his brother-in-law. The relationship between the Ingalls household and the Fields family gave Laura's observations of Big Jerry a proximity that the camp at large, with its rumours and its rifles, never had. The novel builds on that foundation, and then goes further than the historical record can follow. This is the moment the whole story has been building toward. A threatening stranger follows the Ingalls family wagon. The danger is immediate. The family is vulnerable in the way that a family on an open road in open country with no law nearby is vulnerable. And then Big Jerry appears. He intercepts the stranger. He handles the situation with enough unmistakable authority that the stranger understands, and the family is safe, and the road is clear. It is a perfectly constructed piece of narrative. The outsider, the man the camp had deemed dangerous and probably criminal, turns out to be the very protection standing between the innocent family and the actual harm. The real danger is a stranger. The man who saves them is the one the camp wanted to shoot. There is something genuinely powerful in that reversal. But here is what PBS American Masters, working from the archival record, states directly. There is no record of the real Big Jerry performing any of these feats. Pa was not protected by a mixed heritage friend in any document historians have located. The heroic scene has no corroboration outside Wilder's own retrospective account. That does not mean it did not happen. It means the archive does not confirm it. And in a story about how myth gets made, that distinction is everything. The Pioneer Girl manuscript presents Big Jerry's episodes in less resolved form. The Pioneer Girl Project's annotations, which track the differences between the manuscript and the published novels, confirm that the earlier version contained material judged too rough for children's publishing. The editorial process moved consistently in one direction, toward a Big Jerry who was more narratively bounded, whose mixed heritage identity remained present, but whose rougher edges, the actual texture of camp hostility toward him, the harder social reality of his position, were shaped to fit the moral framework the children's novels required. What pioneer girl gestured toward, the Little House books decided not to carry. You cannot talk about this transformation without talking about Rose. Rose Wilder Lane was, by 1930, significantly more experienced as a writer than her mother. She had published novels, journalism, and widely read political essays. She had a working understanding of editorial markets and narrative architecture that Laura, who had spent most of her life on farms and only began writing seriously in her 40s, did not have in the same way. Scholars have debated for decades exactly how much of the Little House books Rose wrote, rewrote, suggested, insisted upon, or shaped without Laura's full awareness of the implications. Carolyn Fraser's Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls. Wilder, published in 2017 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize for biography, is the most comprehensive examination of this question. Drawing on unpublished manuscripts, letters, diaries, and financial records, Fraser documents that Rose's contribution went well beyond editorial suggestion and into structural reconstruction. The books that emerged from their collaboration were not purely Laura's voice. They were the product of a working partnership never fully acknowledged during either woman's lifetime, only reconstructed from correspondence and draft comparisons after Rose's death in 1968. For Big Jerry, what this means practically is that the character in By the Shores of Silver Lake was shaped not only by Laura's memory, but by Rose's judgment about what function a mixed heritage character could serve in a story aimed at American children in 1939. The heroic protector role Big Jerry is given, the moment that resolves his earlier ambiguity by placing him firmly on the side of the white family, is exactly the kind of narrative solution a writer with Rose's experience would have recognized as useful. It makes Big Jerry sympathetic. It gives him a plot function. It closes the tension his racial ambiguity creates in a way that leaves the child reader satisfied rather than unsettled. It also forecloses the harder version of his story. The word used in the novel to describe Big Jerry, half-breed, carried specific legal and social meaning in 1879. It designated a person as belonging fully to neither community from which they came, which in practice meant outside the protections and standing of both. In a railroad camp, it functioned as a target. In 1939, when By the Shores of Silver Lake was published, the term appeared in the text without triggering editorial objection at Harper Brothers. It was accepted as the language of the world being described. Today, it reads differently. That difference is part of what drives the contemporary scholarly re-examination of these books. The PBS American Masters essay on Wilder, produced by writers working from the published biographical scholarship, describes the Little House books as promoting what critics have called a myth of white self-sufficiency, a vision of the frontier in which the land was essentially empty before the settlers arrived, in which indigenous people were either threatening or absent, and in which the rare non-white character who received sympathetic treatment was sympathetic precisely because he served white narrative needs. On that reading, Big Jerry is not a character who challenges the system. He's a character the system absorbs. His mixed heritage identity is deployed at the moment the narrative needs a figure who is neither fully inside nor fully outside the white world. And then he is sent off stage, back to the prairie, back to the gambling and the rumours and the history that did not write his name down. That is a hard reading. It is also, the evidence suggests, an accurate one. And it does not cancel the other reading, the one where Pa trusted him, where a 12-year-old girl stored the image of him for 60 years, where the care he showed old Johnny on a cold Dakota night was real enough that it survived the editorial process and made it into a children's book that millions of people read. Both things can be true at once. The story can be shaped by the racial politics of its era, and still contain, inside that shaping, a genuine act of human recognition. Literature does this, history does this, people do this. There are two Big Jerrys. There is the Big Jerry of the page, the one in the red shirt on the white horse, the gambler with the violent reputation, the man who protected the family from the threatening stranger and sat up through the cold night caring for old Johnny. That Big Jerry is vivid. He's alive in the way well-written characters are alive, specific, morally complex with a physical presence that holds the page. And then there is the Big Jerry of the world, the one whose legal name we do not know, the one who appears in census and draft records only as a hypothesis, a Eugene who might be Almina Fields' brother, a Jerry whose name echoes a nephew's draft card, a mixed French Indigenous man whose physical description in the Fields family records is consistent with Wilder's account, but consistent enough with other members of the same family that it cannot be confirmed. No census entry, no land record, no death certificate has been found that clearly names the man behind the nickname. The archive holds Fred and Almina Fields in considerable detail. Their movements traceable from Canada through Dakota Territory to California, where Fred died in Montebello in 1933 and Almina 2 years later. The man who came with Fred Fields to Silver Lake Camp leaves almost nothing in the official record at the point the camp disperses. Quiet in the specific, enforced way that mixed heritage people in 1879 Dakota Territory went quiet, not because they did not exist, but because the record-keeping systems of that world were not built to hold them. And sitting right next to that silence, on a library shelf, is a children's book in which he is the most vivid person in the room. Think about that. The novel contains more physical description of a real man than any legal document that has survived. Laura Ingalls Wilder's memory, imperfect, shaped, filtered through Rose and Harper Brothers and the requirements of American children's publishing, preserved more of him than the official record did. That is not comfort exactly. It is something stranger than comfort. The myth remembered him better than the truth did. At the very beginning of this story, in the cold open, in the dark, or as with the men waiting in the grass and the rifles loaded, we named a question. There was a night when men planned to kill Big Jerry. That night exists only in memory. In the memory of a 12-year-old girl lying awake inside a shanty listening for a gunshot. In the account she wrote 60 years later in pencil on cheap school tablets. In the version that survived Rose's hands and Harper's requirements and made it into a novel. She remembered the fear. She remembered the dark. She remembered that someone she knew was in danger because of who he was and what the camp had decided about him. She remembered that the gunshot did not come. What the record tells us is simpler and more devastating. He was there. The camp was real. The threat was the kind of threat that mixed heritage men in 1879 Dakota Territory faced not as an exceptional incident, but as the ordinary background noise of their lives. And the girl who remembered him was, in her imperfect and beautiful and myth-laden way, the only person who thought it was worth remembering at all. That is not nothing. That is, in this story, almost everything. The morning is coming up over the prairie. The camp is beginning to stir. And somewhere in the thin light of a Dakota dawn, a man we know only by one name is saddling a white horse and riding somewhere the archive cannot follow. Not yet. Come with me. We're going further in. Here is something historians do not talk about enough. The archive is not neutral. We think of it that way. We think of it as a vault, a place where facts go to be preserved without preference, without politics, without the kind of human choices that distort memory. Put enough documents in a large enough building, and eventually the truth will emerge from the pile. But the archive was built by people. It was fed by people. And the people who built it and fed it made choices every single day about whose movements were worth recording and whose were not. About which names deserved a file and which deserved only a nickname shouted across a camp. About which families generated the kind of paperwork, the land filings, the homestead proofs, the deed transfers, the newspaper notices, the church records, that leaves a trail wide enough to follow 140 years later. What this chapter is about is where those trails go. And where they stop, because after the Silver Lake camp broke up, after the tracks moved west and the Dakota Central pushed toward its next town, and the men who built it dispersed across the prairie, two very different things happened to the people in this story. And the difference between what happened to Fred and Almina Fields and what happened to the man who came with them tells you something true about how history works. Not just in 1879, but in every era, in every country, in every archive that has ever decided whose life was worth a line in the ledger. By 1880, Charles Ingalls had made a decision that changed the shape of the rest of his family's life. He filed a homestead claim near De Smet, the small town forming on the land the Dakota Central had just opened up, and the family moved from the railroad-owned surveyor's house they had occupied through the winter of 1879 to 1880 onto land they were formally claiming as their own. The 1880 census places the Ingalls family in Dakota Territory not as floating figures, but as registered presences, names in a column, in a county, on a page that would be filed, archived, and eventually become the kind of document researchers cite when they say, "We know they were there." That is what a homestead claim does. It plugs a family into the machinery of official record-keeping in a way that creates a paper trail durable enough to survive a century and a half. Every subsequent transaction, the land proofs, the crop reports, the church membership, the school enrollment, the town newspaper that ran notices about local residents, each was a new line in the ledger. Each was another piece of evidence that could be found, pulled, and assembled into something approximating a life. Charles Ingalls, born 1836, died 1902. Those dates exist in the archive. The space between them is filled. Frederick William Fields followed a comparable path. After the railroad work concluded, Fields moved his family to Turner County in Dakota Territory, where Pioneer Girl Project researchers confirm he completed homestead proof by the mid-1880s. His occupation in later records shifts: railroad overseer, then farmer, then hotel and restaurant work, a sequence that reflects what happened to men who managed the frontier's construction phase, when that phase ended and the region transitioned to agricultural settlement. Fred Fields made that conversion. The record shows it happening. Almina Fields, recorded as Marguerite Almina Bressard or Broussard depending on the document, the spelling of French-Canadian surnames in American records varying by the enumerator's phonetic confidence, appears in successive censuses with ages that shift slightly from count to count, as was common when birth dates were approximate knowledge rather than documented fact. She was born in December 1854 in Canada. She died on June 17, 1935, in California. Fred had preceded her, dying on November 20th, 1933, in Montebello, California, at the age of 89. Their movements from Dakota Territory through Turner County to California are traceable through the records at every stage. Fred and Almina Fields had 13 surviving children, 13 human beings who were born, grew up, registered for things, signed things, and left traces in the archive of the kind that children of a documented family tend to leave. Among those records, in the World War I draft cards the US government collected from men born in the 1880s and 1890s, researcher Nancy Cleaveland noticed a detail she worked through carefully and tagged appropriately as speculative rather than confirmed. One of Fred and Almina's sons was named Eugene Joseph Fields. On his World War I draft card, he appears under the name Jerry Joseph Fields. Think about that for a moment. The same person carries two names across two official documents. In one, he is Eugene. In another, he is Jerry. The same shift, from Eugene to Jerry, appears in the family pattern the Pioneer Girl Project researchers are trying to trace. Because the best current hypothesis about Big Jerry's identity links him to a male relative recorded as Eugene on an 1860 census. Possibly Almina's brother, possibly a relation from the Bressard family she came from. What Cleveland is pointing toward, carefully with the appropriate scholarly caution that this kind of fragmentary evidence requires, is a naming pattern within the extended Fields family. A pattern where Eugene and Jerry are not two separate names but two versions of the same person. A pattern where the nickname could have travelled from Almina's brother into the next generation, carried forward by a son named in a relative's honour. That is not proof. No document has been found that directly names any member of the Fields or Bressard family as Big Jerry. No census, no land record, no newspaper notice, no court filing. There was no draft card says, "This is the man." The outline is explicit about this, and the research treats it accordingly. What the records say instead is something harder to hold and more honest. They say maybe. They say probably. They say this is the shape of the family. This is the naming pattern. These are the physical descriptions that are consistent, and this is as close as the archive will let you get. For anyone trying to understand who stood in that camp in 1879, who rode a white horse with enough authority to make a 12-year-old remember him for 60 years, who sat up through a cold Dakota night caring for a dying Irish water carrier. Maybe, and probably, are enormously frustrating words, but they are the honest ones. The draft cards of the Field Sons describe men with stout builds, black hair and brown eyes. Dos Wilder describes Big Jerry as physically imposing, large, striking. The kind of physical presence that reads differently in a camp where most men are lean from hard labour and poor food. The description matches, but it matches multiple members of the Field's extended family. It matches any number of men with French, Canadian and Indigenous ancestry in the Northern Plains in the 1870s and 1880s. It does not narrow the field to one person. It narrows it to a type, to a heritage, to a probable ethnic background that is consistent with what Wilder describes. But it cannot point at a single face and say, him. This is not a failure of the research. This is what honest archival work looks like when the subject is a working-class mixed heritage man in 1879 Dakota Territory. The archive was not designed to individuate people like him. It was designed to track land ownership and military obligation and tax liability. A man who rented rather than owned, who gambled rather than farmed, who moved with the railroad rather than settling beside it, who had no court cases in his name, and no newspaper coverage because nothing he did was the kind of thing newspapers considered worth printing. That man leaves a thin trail. The edge of what we know about Big Jerry is a naming pattern in a family that moved to California. It is physical descriptions that fit but don't confirm. It is a 60-year-old woman's memory in a children's book, and a scholarly article that uses the phrase best current hypothesis. That edge is where we're standing right now, and it matters enormously that we name it as an edge rather than pretend it is a flaw. By the time Fred Fields died in Montebello in November 1933, something had happened that makes the contrast between his documented life and Big Jerry's undocumented one almost unbearable to sit with. Laura Ingalls Wilder had become famous. Little House in the Big Woods, the first of the series, had been published by Harper in 1932. Farmer Boy followed in 1933, the very year Fred died. Published in October, drawing comparisons from contemporary reviewers to the era's popular rural fiction, a genre that Depression-era America was consuming hungrily and described as a record of a vanishing phase of American life. The books were selling. The children reading them were writing letters. The story of a pioneer family's hard but virtuous life on the American frontier was landing exactly as intended in a Depression-era America that desperately needed stories about ordinary people who survived difficult things with their dignity intact. Fred Fields died in November 1933 in the same California, where those books were being read, being shelved in libraries, being given to children by grandmothers who said, without quite knowing the full complexity of what they were handing over, this is what America was. Did Fred Fields know the books existed? Did he recognize in them the family he had eaten dinner with in the surveyor's house at Silver Lake? The family whose daughter had watched him and his brother-in-law with the particular intensity of a child storing everything for later? The archive does not say, and no correspondence between Fields and Wilder has been identified in any collection. No newspaper notices reports that the old railroad overseer read the novels and recognized himself, which is, of course, exactly the problem. The surveyor's house at Silver Lake, the railroad-owned structure where the Ingalls family wintered in 1879 to 1880, where Fred Fields ate with them, where Big Jerry sometimes came, did not disappear. It still stands. The original surveyor's house was moved from its Silver Lake location into De Smet proper, where it is preserved today as part of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society heritage site. Visitors can walk through it, stand in the rooms where Ma kept house for the surveying crew, and look at the same proportions of space where a 12-year-old girl lay awake in the dark listening for a gunshot that never came. De Smet grew into a permanent town with streets and a main street and a church and a school and that heritage site, because that is what happens when a child with a gift for memory grows up in a place and writes about it. with enough love to make millions of other people feel they have been there too. The town became the book. The book became the town. The camp that preceded it left no equivalent physical trace outside that single preserved structure. The bunkhouses where 16 men slept in July heat and January cold are gone. The cook shanty is gone. The card games and the rumours and the particular late-night tension of a camp that has decided one of its members is dangerous, all of it is gone with the structures that held it. What survived was what always survives. The things people wrote down and the things they remembered long enough to write down later. Here is the part of this chapter I want you to carry into everything that comes next. Fred Fields left 13 children. Their draft cards are in the archive. Their census appearances are in the archive. Their marriages and deaths and land transactions and military registrations are in the archive. The Fields family left an archival footprint that researchers can follow from Dakota Territory to Turner County to Montebello, California, across 50-plus years of documented American life. The man they called Big Jerry left a nickname in a children's book. That is the entire difference between them, and that difference has nothing to do with who was more important, or who lived a fuller life, or who contributed more to the world being built in that railroad camp in 1879. It has to do with something much simpler and much more brutal. It has to do with which categories of person the record-keeping systems of 19th century America were built to capture, and which they were built to let slip through. Fred Fields owned land. He filed claims. He appeared in census after census as the head of a large rooted family that generated documentation archives are designed to preserve. Big Jerry, if the hypothesis is correct that he was Almina's brother, moving with the railroad, gambling, carrying no land claim, filing no homestead, accumulating no property in any county or territory that would have created a legal relationship requiring his name to be written down, was exactly the kind of person the system was designed not to see. Not because of malice, necessarily. Not because someone decided to erase him, but because the systems that generate archival records are systems built around ownership, around property, around the legal relationships that come from having something the state needs to track. A man who moves with the work rather than settling beside it, who has mixed heritage in a system that assigns rights along racial lines. That man can live a full and vivid and consequential life, and the archive will barely notice. That is not a problem unique to 1879. It is not a problem unique to the frontier. It is the specific and structural way that history forgets, not in dramatic erasures, not in deliberate cover-ups, but in the ordinary, daily, institutional indifference of record-keeping systems toward the people they were never designed to count. The Pioneer Girl Project researchers who traced the Fields family found Fred Fields' death record, Almina Fields' death record, the draft card for Eugene Joseph Fields, listed as Jerry Joseph Fields. Physical descriptions consistent with Wilder's account. They did not find a death certificate for a man named Big Jerry. They did not find a grave. They did not find a legal name confirmed as the man who rode a white horse into Silver Lake Camp in 1879. The hypothesis stands. It is the best the evidence currently supports, but it is still a hypothesis. And somewhere in the descendants of Fred and Almina Fields, whose children had children who are alive today, whose genealogical line runs forward from that surveyor's house into the present, oral tradition may have preserved what the archive did not. Someone in that family may have been told a story about a relative who worked the railroad, rode a white horse, was known as Big Jerry in the camps, or they may not have. The oral tradition is as fragile as the archive, maybe more so. We have been following two tracks through this story. The track of the historical record, detailed and documented for the Ingalls family and for Fred and Almina Fields, sparse to the point of near silence for the man we're trying to find. And the track of the literary record, rich and specific and vivid for Big Jerry, and deliberately shaped in ways that Chapter 3 laid out. The next question is the one those two tracks have been building toward together. When Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose sat down to turn Pioneer Girl into the Little House books, when they made the decisions, consciously or not, about what to keep and what to soften and what to give Big Jerry on the page that the real world had refused to give him, what were they actually doing to the memory of a man who had no other advocate? Were they preserving him imperfectly, incompletely, within a framework shaped by the racial politics of their era, but preserving him nonetheless? Or were they using him, turning a real person into a narrative tool, a moral counterweight, a safety valve for the labour tensions the book needed to diffuse, a noble outsider whose goodness served white narrative comfort in a way that honoured the surface of his life while burying the depth of it? The honest answer is both, and holding both at once is hard. It is supposed to be hard, because the people who loved this story as children deserve to understand what they were loving, not so it can be taken away from them, but so they can hold it with the complexity it has always contained, so they can see the red shirt and the white horse, and know that underneath the image there is a real man who deserved a story that answered to his name rather than the name a camp gave him. We're going to get as close to that story as the evidence allows. The morning is bright over the California valley where Fred Fields is buried. The prairie is 1,000 miles away, and the man with the white horse is somewhere between the archive and the novel, between the hypothesis and the name, between the life that was lived and the story that survived. Come with me. The next chapter is where we begin to close the distance. Picture a farmhouse in the Ozark Hills in 1930. Not the famous one from the television show, not the sunlit prairie farmhouse with the sweeping fields and the golden light of a world that has always had enough. The real one. Rocky Ridge Farm, Mansfield, Missouri. A house that took 17 years to finish because the people building it could only add a room when they had the money, which meant it grew slowly, season by season, shaped by the specific arithmetic of what was possible rather than what was wanted. The woman at the table is 63 years old. Her hands are not soft. They have spent decades doing the kind of work that is not kind to hands. Farm work, household work, the physical labour of a life that has never had the luxury of delegation. She's writing in pencil, on cheap school tablets, in a handwriting that is clear and direct and does not waste space. She's writing about a railroad camp in Dakota Territory in 1879, about her father, who trusted people the camp did not trust, about a man in a red shirt on a white horse, about a cold night and a woman and a girl listening in the dark, about everything she saw at 12 that the adult world around her was not paying attention to. Pioneer Girl, that is what she will call it. And here is what the New York publishers are going to say when they read it. It is too much. This chapter is about what happens next, about the specific mechanism by which Pioneer Girl, that direct, unpolished adult account of a real frontier life, gets transformed into something the market will receive, about the woman who helped build that mechanism, about the ideology that shaped the choices they made, about a man named Roger Lee McBride who inherited something he was never meant to have, and about a room full of librarians in New Orleans in 2018 who looked at a name on an award and voted 12-0 to take it down. Whose story is this anyway? In 1930, when Pioneer Girl went out to publishers through Rose Wilder Lane's contacts in New York, the responses were consistent in substance even when they varied in phrasing. The material was episodic. It didn't build toward resolution in the way that adult readers, trained by fiction, whole expected a memoir to build. In some areas, the violence, the racial tensions, the grinding economic fear that ran beneath every pioneer year, it was rougher than the adult memoir market of 1930 could comfortably absorb. Publishers in 1930 were operating inside a specific cultural moment. The Depression had arrived. The readership was now living through hardship of its own, and the emotional appetite had shifted. People wanted to be reminded that hard times could be survived. They wanted the version where difficulty has meaning, where work pays off, where the family that holds together comes through. Pioneer Girl as written didn't quite deliver that. It delivered the truth, which is something different. And truth, in 1930, was a harder sell than hope. What Rose Wilder Lane understood, with the particular clarity of a professional writer who had been reading market signals for years, was that the material needed restructuring, not abandonment, restructuring. The raw material of her mother's life was genuinely extraordinary. A childhood on the actual frontier, moving from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Dakota Territory, covering the specific years when the American West was transitioning from indigenous land to settler territory. That was an astonishing story. It just needed a different shape. The shape it needed, Rose concluded, was a children's book. Before we go any further into what the transformation involved, we need to spend time with the woman who made it possible. Because the history of the Little House books are in ways never fully acknowledged during either woman's lifetime, the history of two authors working in close collaboration, one of whom got her name on the covers. Rose Wilder Lane was born in 1886 in Dakota Territory, the only child of Laura and Almanzo Wilder to survive to adulthood. By 1930, she was a 44-year-old professional writer of considerable reputation. She had published novels, journalism, and widely read political essays. She had travelled extensively, Europe, the Middle East, Albania, in an era when American women of her background rarely left the country. She was a significantly more experienced literary professional than her mother, who had only begun writing seriously in her 40s as a contributor to the Missouri Ruralist farm paper. She was also something else that matters enormously. Rose Wilder Lane was, by the early 1930s, developing the political philosophy that would eventually identify her as one of the founding figures of American libertarianism. She believed, with increasing conviction, in individual self-sufficiency as the supreme American virtue. She believed that the state was, almost by definition, an obstacle to human freedom. She believed that the story of America was best told as the story of individuals and families who made their own way without collective support, who built what they had from nothing and owed their survival to their own work and their own choices. That political philosophy is not incidental to the Little House books. It is threaded through every editorial decision Rose made about what to include and what to leave out, what to frame as personal struggle and what to soften into background. When you understand what Rose believed, you understand why the Little House books present the frontier as a place where a family with enough love and enough work ethic could survive anything. You understand why the structural supports the real Ingalls family depended on, the railroad's corporate infrastructure, government land policies, the neighbours and community networks, tend to recede into background or disappear. You understand why hardship in the books is personal and resolvable, rather than systemic and structural, and you begin to understand with fresh eyes what happens to a character like Big Jerry in that framework. A mixed heritage man whose very existence raises questions about whose land this was and whose labour built it. That character does not fit cleanly into a story about white self-sufficiency. He can be included, but he has to be managed, given a role that serves the narrative rather than disrupting it. Made useful before he's allowed to exit the frame. The Pioneer Girl Project, the scholarly initiative at the South Dakota Historical Society that produced the 2014 annotated edition and continues to publish research volumes, has done the painstaking work of comparing the Little House manuscript drafts against each other and against Pioneer Girl. What that comparison shows is a consistent directional movement from the rougher toward the smoother, from the more ambiguous toward the more resolved, from the episodic toward the architectural, from the uncomfortable toward the manageable. Pamela Smith Hill, the editor of the annotated Pioneer Girl, and Nancy Cleaveland, who leads the Pioneer Girl project, have been transparent about this pattern in their published work. Carolyn Fraser's Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, published in 2017 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize for biography, maps it in considerable detail for a general audience. The specific mechanism worked like this. Laura would send drafts to Rose. Rose would respond, sometimes with editorial suggestions, sometimes with partial rewrites, sometimes with structural interventions that reshaped entire episodes. The correspondence between them tracked the evolution of each book, and in that evolution, the episodes raising the most editorial difficulty involved racial complexity, labour conflict, poverty, and moral ambiguity. The categories of material that the children's publishing market of the 1930s had no framework for in a book aimed at 8-year-olds. Big Jerry was one of those episodes. The Pioneer Girl Project's research confirms that the Pioneer Girl version of events around him was considered too rough for the published children's books, and that the editorial process moved consistently toward making him more narratively useful and less unsettling. The care for old Johnny The image of a mixed heritage gambler sitting up through a cold night to feed and warm a dying old Irishman survives largely intact. It demonstrates individual virtue in a way the children's novel requires. The rougher elements, the specific texture of camp hostility toward him, the harder edges of what his mixed heritage status meant in the daily social reality of an 1879 railroad camp, those were filed down. This is how children's publishing worked. The market creates a template. The editor shapes the material to fit. The template is built by someone with a particular view of what readers can handle and what they should be given. In 1939, the template was a pioneer childhood remembered with love and precision, in which hardship has meaning and virtue is eventually rewarded. Big Jerry fit that template in the shape he was given. He would not have fitted in the shape he started. The question of how much Rose Wilder Lane wrote, not edited, not suggested, but wrote, of the Little House books has been a live scholarly debate for decades. The answer the evidence supports is more than the covers indicated. The drafts show Rose's interventions going beyond line editing into structural reconstruction. Episodes were reorganized. Scenes were added. The narrative voice, that particular clear, warm, precise, child-eye perspective that makes the books feel so immediate, was shaped not just by Laura's memory, but by Rose's understanding of how to present that memory on the page. This does not mean Laura is not the author of the Little House books. She is. Her memories are the source material. Her childhood is what the books are about. But the books that reached readers were collaborative products, and the collaboration went unacknowledged in a way that served the mythology and obscured the mechanism. The full extent of Rose's contribution was only reconstructed from correspondence and draft comparisons that became available after her death in 1968. For Big Jerry, this means the character you meet in By the Shores of Silver Lake was shaped not only by Laura's memory, but by Rose's judgment about what role a mixed heritage character could play in a story aimed at American children in 1939. The heroic protector function, the moment that resolves his ambiguity by placing him firmly on the side of the white family, is exactly the kind of narrative beta writer with Rose's experience would have recognized as useful. It closes the tension his racial ambiguity creates in a way that leaves the child reader satisfied rather than disturbed. It also removes the need to deal with what actually happened to a man like Big Jerry in the real world. In the real world, a mixed heritage gambler suspected of horse theft at an 1879 railroad camp did not generally get a heroic moment. He got a harder version of the story, and the harder version is what Pioneer Girl gestured toward, and the Little House books decided not to carry. Laura Ingalls Wilder died on February 10, 1957 at Rocky Ridge Farm, 3 days after her 90th birthday. She had written her will in the early 1950s. In it, she made her intentions clear. She left a life interest in her copyrights to Rose. After Rose's death, the royalties were intended to benefit the Mansfield, Missouri Library, the institution in the town where she had lived for 6 decades, whose reading room bore her name. That was the intention. What happened was something else. Rose Wilder Lane died in 1968 with no children or surviving husband. In her own will, she left the Wilder copyrights not to the Mansfield Library, but to Roger Lee McBride, a lawyer and writer who had become close to her in her later years and whom she treated as an adoptive grandson. McBride, in turn, wrote his own series of Little House continuation books before dying in 1995, at which point his estate, including the Wilder copyrights, passed to his designated heir, Abigail McBride Allen. By the late 1990s, the Mansfield Library had entered litigation. The dispute involved HarperCollins, the McBride estate, and the question of what Laura's 1952 testamentary intent had been. The library had received only a small fraction of the royalties Laura had intended for it, a figure documented in legal scholarship on the estate dispute. And critically, in 1972, Mayer had endorsed a royalty check that included language renouncing all further claims, a legal move that later severely complicated its case. A law review article in the St. Louis University Law Journal in 2000, titled with academic precision, "Little Copyright Dispute on the Prairie, Unbumping the Will of Laura Ingalls Wilder," analysed how statutory copyright renewal rules had functionally redirected the estate away from Laura's intentions. The court case was settled in an undisclosed manner. McBride's heirs retained the rights. The myth-making machine does not only work on railroad workers, it works on everyone who passes through it. On June 23, 2018, during the American Library Association's annual conference and exhibition in New Orleans, the board of the Association for Library Service to Children voted unanimously to remove Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from the award it had given in her honour since 1954. The award had been called the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, given to authors and illustrators whose work had made a substantial and lasting contribution to children's literature. Previous recipients included E.B. White, Beverly Cleary, Maurice Sendak. One of the highest honours in the field, the board voted to rename it the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The stated reason, in the organisation's public statement released jointly by ALA, President Jim Neal and ALSC President Nina Lindsay, was that Wilder's body of work includes expressions of stereotypical attitudes inconsistent with ALSC's core values of inclusiveness, integrity and respect, bias and responsiveness. The public response was intense and divided. People who had grown up with the Little House books, which is to say an enormous percentage of the American reading public over the age of 30, reacted from a complex place. Some were relieved, some were furious, some were grieving in a way that surprised them, because losing the clean version of a beloved childhood story is a genuine loss, even when the replacement is more honest. The 2018 vote was not a sudden decision by a group of radicals. It was the institutional expression of a scholarly conversation building for decades, the same conversation that produced Prairie Fires in 2017, The Annotated Pioneer Girl in 2014, and Donna M. Campbell's essay, Wild Men and Dissenting Voices, Narrative Disruption in Little House on the Prairie, Zoss published in the Great Plains Quarterly in spring 2000, which examined the narrative disruption that characters like Big Jerry introduced into the otherwise orderly moral world of the Little House books. That scholarly conversation had been asking in academic language the same question the 2018 vote asked in institutional language, the same question this documentary is asking in the language of a documentary. What did the Little House books teach generations of American children about who belonged in this country and who didn't? There is a literary term for what Big Jerry represents in the structure of the Little House narrative. It is worth deploying carefully. The noble savage figure, a character type in which a non-white person is presented as noble and admirable, precisely in proportion to their usefulness to white protagonists. Hey, the nobility is real within the story's own logic. But it is bounded nobility. It validates the white character's perception of themselves as fair-minded, rather than actually centering the non-white character's own interiority, history, or agency. Big Jerry's kindness to old Johnny is moving. His loyalty is genuine, but we never see the world from inside his perspective. We only ever see him from outside, through Laura's child eyes, through the camp's rumours, through Pa's charitable skepticism, his own understanding of why he stays in camps that want to shoot him, his own experience of moving through a world that assigned him a role he did not choose. None of that is in the text, because the text was not built to hold it. The text was built to hold Laura, and in a text built to hold Laura, Big Jerry is supporting cast, however vivid, or however remembered, however real the man behind him may have been. Scholar Donna M. Campbell names this directly in her essay published in the Great Plains Quarterly. The Little House books promoted a myth of white self-sufficiency in which the land was essentially empty before the settlers arrived, in which indigenous people were either threatening or absent, and in which the rare non-white character who received sympathetic treatment served white narrative needs. Big Jerry, on this reading, is not an exception to the pattern. He is its most sophisticated expression. That is a hard reading to sit with if you loved the red shirt and the white horse, if those images have been part of your interior landscape for decades. But sitting with it is what the evidence requires. Both things can be true at once. The story can be shaped by the racial politics of its era and still contain, inside that shaping, a genuine act of human recognition. Pa trusted him. A 12-year-old girl stored his image for 60 years. The care he showed old Johnny was real enough to survive the editorial process and make it into a book that millions of people read. Literature does this. History does this. People do this. We've been building towards something across these 5 chapters. In the cold open, we gave you a dark prairie night, and men with rifles and a question the archive couldn't answer. In Chapter 1, the world those men inhabited, the railroad camp, the labour, the wages, the specific social geography of a place built to be temporary. In Chapter 2, the real Tracy riot and the labour conflict that happened somewhere else and got relocated by memory and narrative necessity, with Big Jerry as its convenient resolution. In Chapter 3, the editorial machinery, 2 women at a table, the publisher's requirements, the ideology of a particular American myth-making moment. In Chapter 4, the archive's silence, the Fields family documented in California, the naming patterns, the hypothesis that is the best we have, and the honest acknowledgement that it is still only a hypothesis. Now we have given you the afterlife, the copyright dispute that redirected a woman's own will, the unanimous vote in New Orleans, the scholars and librarians and indigenous voices that said, we need to look at this differently. There is 1 chapter left. It is the chapter the entire story has been building toward. Not the historical chapter. We have laid all the history the evidence supports. The personal chapter. The one where we close the loop between what happened in 1879 and what it means right now. Between a man the archive barely held and a story that millions of people carry in their bodies as part of who they think America was. The question we're going to end with is not a historical question. It is a present tense one. When you know everything we have told you across these 5 chapters, when you know about the Tracy riot and the Fields family and the draft cards and the editorial decisions and Rose's libertarian philosophy and the 12-0 vote in New Orleans, when you know all of that, what do you do with the image you have been carrying since childhood? Gauze, the red shirt, the white horse, the cold Dakota night. What do you do with the love? That is the question Chapter 6 will answer. And the answer, I promise you, is not what you think it is. I want to take you back to the beginning. Not to a library shelf, not to a publishing house in New York in 1939, not to a farmhouse in Missouri where a 63-year-old woman is writing in pencil on school tablets. I want to take you back further than all of that. I want to take you back to a night. It is 1879, maybe 1880. The exact season, as we have established across this entire documentary, sits slightly beyond the edge of what the archive confirms with certainty. The Dakota Territory sky is doing what it does in October or November, going dark in the east before it has finished with the west, stars appearing so fast and, in such numbers, they look less like something that was always there, and more like something being actively produced, the way a fire produces sparks. The prairie wind has that particular cut, not violent, not a storm wind, just relentless, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself but simply accumulates until you realise sometime after it began that you have been cold for a while. In a shanty near the Silver Lake camp, a girl and her mother are lying awake in the dark. Not because they can't sleep, because somewhere outside, on a horse or on foot, or somewhere in the space between the campfire light and the open prairie, there is a man who may or may not be safe. And the men who are not safe for him are somewhere in the dark too, and there are more of them, and they have rifles. And the night is the kind of night that makes the worst version of things feel very close to possible. The gunshot doesn't come. Morning comes instead, and in that particular unrepeatable silence between the last moment of fear and the first moment of relief, a 12-year-old girl stores something, files it, puts it in the part of herself that will still be open and functional 60 years later, when she sits down with a pencil and tries to tell the truth about what the West was actually like before the stories about it got too smooth to recognise. When she finally writes it, the chapter she puts him in will be called Horse Thieves. When Pa whispers to Ma that night, his exact words are, "The best of it is, Caroline, there'll never be a horse stolen from Silver Lake Camp," and that is everything she gives us, the whisper. The morning. The man on the white horse riding toward the workers and then gone. This chapter is about what she did with what she stored, and about what we do with what she gave us. Here is everything we have told you. assembled in one place, not as a summary, as a map. We know the railroad camp at Silver Lake in 1879 Dakota Territory was real. Charles Ingalls worked there as store manager and timekeeper. Frederick William Fields worked there as overseer, and sometimes brought with him a relative by marriage. A mixed French and Indigenous man the camp knew only as Big Jerry. We know the camp suspected Big Jerry of involvement in horse theft, and that Pa Ingalls specifically rejected that suspicion. We know Big Jerry sat up through a cold night caring for an elderly Irish water carrier named Old Johnny, when Old Johnny could not care for himself. We know the camp's hostility toward him was serious enough that on at least one night, violence was a real possibility. We know the riot episode in By the Shores of Silver Lake has no corroboration in any record near De Smet. The riot that actually happened was at Tracy, Minnesota, in June 1879, covered in the St. Paul Globe, involving real workers demanding real wages, a local sheriff named J.A. Hunter, and a governor who telegraphed for militia. That real event was relocated and reframed in the novel to give Big Jerry a heroic function the historical record does not support. We know that Pioneer Girl contained Big Jerry's episodes in less sanitized form. We know the transformation into By the Shores of Silver Lake involved Rose Wilder Lane's editorial hands and political philosophy, and Harper's requirements for the children's market of the late 1930s. We know the transformation moved consistently toward making Big Jerry more useful to the white family's narrative and less unsettling to the white child reader. We know Fred Fields died, documented in California in 1933, Almina Fields in 1935, that among their 13 surviving children, a son named Eugene Joseph Fields appears on a World War I draft card as Jerry Joseph Fields, a naming pattern researcher Nancy Cleaveland traces as the best current hypothesis for connecting Big Jerry to the Bressard family, to a male relative recorded as Eugene on an 1860 census, to the man on the white horse. We know we cannot confirm it. We know the archive goes quiet at the exact moment we most need it to speak. It is also worth naming honestly. The hypothesis that Big Jerry was Almina's brother is the best available, but it is not the only possibility. He may have been connected to the Bressard family through a different line entirely. He may have been a man with no surviving paper trail whatsoever, not because he was related to anyone the archive tracked, but because he was precisely the kind of person the archive was never designed to track. The research holds these possibilities open. So should we. And we know that on June 23, 2018 in New Orleans, the board of the Association for Library Service to Children voted 12-0, unanimously to rename the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award the Children's Literature Legacy Award. And when that vote was announced, the audience in the room rose to its feet. That is the map. Now here is the question the map leads to. If you grew up reading these books, and if you're watching a documentary about a minor character in one of them, there is a strong chance you did, then what you are holding in your body right now is something complicated. You are holding genuine love. That is real. The love that gets attached to books you read at the right age, in the right circumstances, is one of the most durable things a human being can carry. It is not rational. It does not care about scholarly critiques or editorial histories or the racial politics of 1930s American publishing. It is just there. The red shirt, the white horse, the cold night, the way Big Jerry looked in your imagination when you were 9 or 10 or 11, and the page was giving you something that felt, in the specific way that great children's literature feels, like a true thing. That love is not the problem. The problem is when that love gets used as a reason not to look. Because sitting right next to the love is this: the understanding that the version of this story you were given as a child was built by people with specific needs and specific blindnesses, that the real man behind the red shirt was not given the same chance that the fictional character was given to be fully seen, that his actual complexity, his mixed heritage, his labour, his navigation of a world that had decided what he was before he opened his mouth, was judged too rough for you to hold as a child. So it was filed down, made manageable, assigned a narrative function, and handed to you in that smoothed form as if the smoothing had not happened. You deserved the truth. You were given a myth instead, and the man behind the myth deserved to be more than useful. Can you love something and know it is incomplete at the same time? The answer is yes. It is one of the most important things a person can learn to do, and it is very hard, and most of us resist it for as long as we possibly can because it feels like betrayal. It feels like if you acknowledge the incompleteness, you are taking something away from the child you were when the book first reached you. But acknowledging the incompleteness is not betrayal. It is the opposite of betrayal. Because what the story was trying to do, at its deepest, most honest level, beneath the editorial decisions and the racial architecture, was to see. Laura Ingalls Wilder was a woman who spent her childhood watching, filing, storing, and in the act of writing it down 60 years later, even though the filters and the revisions and the requirements of a market that didn't want rough edges, she was trying to testify to what she had actually witnessed. She witnessed a man the camp wanted to dismiss, and she didn't dismiss him. She witnessed a man the camp suspected of theft and violence, and she watched her father refuse the suspicion. She witnessed a man who sat up through a cold Dakota night to care for an old Irishman nobody else was caring for. And she stored that image for 60 years and gave it to millions of children. That impulse, the impulse toward honest witness, is the best thing in the books. And it is worth honouring, even as we also honour the truth that the impulse was constrained by forces that shaped what witness was allowed to look like. His name was not Big Jerry. We do not know what his name was. The best hypothesis currently available, still a hypothesis, explicitly tagged as uncertain by every responsible researcher who has examined it, connects him to Almina Fields' family, to a naming pattern that moves between Eugene and Jerry across 2 generations, to draft cards that describe men with dark hair and strong builds in a family with French Canadian and Indigenous ancestry. That hypothesis may be right. It may not be. The frontier of the research is exactly where we have been standing for this entire documentary. At the edge of what the archive holds, are looking at the shape of the silence rather than the thing itself. What the man deserved, from the moment he rode into a camp that had already decided what he was a name. Not Big Jerry, a name. The kind you file a homestead under, the kind that gets written on a draft card, the kind carved onto a stone in a cemetery somewhere in Dakota Territory or California, or wherever the road finally ended for him. He deserved a record. He deserved the ordinary documentation of an ordinary life. Birth, marriage, children, land, death. The basic bureaucratic recognition that a person existed in the world, and the world took note. He didn't get it. Not because his life was not full and consequential, but because the systems that generated that documentation were not built to receive him. Not built to track a man who moved with the railroad rather than settling beside it, who had no land claim and no legal dispute and no church record and no newspaper notice, who was, in the language of every system that should have recorded him, the wrong kind of person in the wrong kind of place at the wrong kind of time, and the only record he got was a children's book written by a woman who loved him in the way that a child loves the people who show her that the world is more generous than it has been told to be. A children's book that was edited to be manageable, that was shaped to serve a myth, that carried him into the hands of millions of people who would remember the red shirt and the white horse and the cold night without ever knowing his real name. That is everything, and it is not enough. Somewhere in this country, there may be people descended from the man the camp called Big Jerry. If the hypothesis is correct, if he was Almina Bressett's brother, then Fred and Almina's 13 documented children are his nieces and nephews. Their children are his great-nieces and great-nephews. Their children's children's children are alive right now, in 2026 in California, or wherever those family branches spread across the decades. They may not know the story we have been telling tonight. They may have grown up reading by the shores of Silver Lake without knowing that the man in the red shirt on the white horse might be their ancestor. They may have filed that image away in exactly the place every other reader filed it, in the part of the mind reserved for vivid characters from beloved books, without any indication that the character had a real face, a real body, a real set of relationships that connected directly to their own family tree. Or they may have known. Family oral tradition is real. It survives in forms that archives don't capture. Someone, in some kitchen in some part of this country, may have told a story about an uncle or a great-uncle who worked the railroad and was known as something, and that something may have been a version of what we have been looking for all night. If that person is watching this documentary right now, if something in these 6 chapters has made you reach for your family history, for the names, for the photographs your grandmother kept in a box that you have not opened since she died, reach for them, because the archive does not end with what the historians have found. The archive ends where the research does, and the research is not finished. The Pioneer Girl Project, the scholarly initiative at the South Dakota Historical Society that produced the 2014 annotated edition, that continues to publish research volumes, tracking the gap between what Laura wrote and what the world received, that project is still ongoing. The genealogical research on Big Jerry is not closed. It is specifically, explicitly open, because Nancy Cleaveland's hypothesis has been published and tagged as speculative precisely because the evidence that would confirm it has not yet been found. The draft card is there, the census entry is there, the naming pattern is there, the physical descriptions are there, but the document that would close the loop, a record that directly connects the man on the white horse to a legal name and a life history, has not been found yet. Which means it may exist. It may be in a county courthouse in South Dakota, or a church record in Quebec, or a probate file in California, or a family Bible in a house somewhere that nobody has thought to look in yet. The archive of a human life is never entirely exhausted. It is only exhausted to the edge of the current search. That is the cliffhanger this story ends on. Not a resolved mystery. Not a neat conclusion where we pull back the curtain and reveal the man's true name and his grave, and the full accounting of his life that he deserved. The cliffhanger is, we don't know yet. Asaksa. And yet is the most important word in that sentence. Here is the answer to the question Chapter 5 planted. You keep it. You keep every bit of it. The red shirt, the white horse, the cold night, the care for old Johnny, the way Pa trusted him when the camp didn't, the way a 12-year-old girl stored the image of a man being treated with decency, in a world organised around his disposability. You keep all of it, because that love was real, and it pointed towards something true even when the vehicle it travelled in was imperfect. And then you add to it. You add the Tracy riot, which was real and happened in June 1879, and involved real workers who were angry about real wages, and a governor who called for real militia. You add Fred and Almina Fields and their 13 children, and the naming pattern in the draft cards. You add Rose Wilder Lane's political philosophy, and its consequences for what the frontier was allowed to look like on the page. You add the 2014 annotated Pioneer Girl, and the 12-0 vote in New Orleans in 2018, and the standing ovation from the audience when that vote was announced. You add the indigenous scholars who read these books from inside the communities, whose dispossession the books perform. You add all of it. And what you get when you add all of it is not a diminished story, it is a larger one. A story big enough to hold the real camp and the real riot and the real man and the real girl and the real editorial decisions and the real silences in the real archive. A story that does not require the convenient heroics to be true in order for the essential humanity to be honoured. Big Jerry was real. Yeah, he was a mixed heritage man who worked a railroad in Dakota Territory in 1879. He was suspected of things he may or may not have done. He was loyal to people the camp had decided were beneath loyalty's investment. He was known to a family who remembered him for decades, and he was transformed by memory and by love and by the requirements of a market and an ideology and a daughter's editorial hands into something that serves a story about America that America badly wanted to believe about itself. He deserved the chance to be more than that. We cannot give him his name back. We cannot reconstruct his life from the silence the archive left. We cannot undo the 60 years that passed between the night he rode away from Silver Lake Camp and the morning Laura sat down to write it all out on those cheap school tablets. But we can do this. Or we can say, clearly and without apology, that he was there, that he mattered to the people who knew him, that the part of Laura's testimony about him that survived the editorial process, the decency, the loyalty, the care for a dying old man on a cold night when no one else was watching. That part is the thing worth carrying forward, not because it confirms the myth, but because it confirms the man, and the man is the thing the myth was built on, and the man is the thing the myth forgot, and recovering the man, even incompletely, even at the edge of what the archive allows, is the only honest thing left to do with the story that outlived him. When the Pioneer Girl Project published its annotated edition in 2014, they included extensive footnotes tracking every person, every place, every event that Laura's original manuscript referenced, hundreds of annotations, thousands of hours of archival research. In the footnotes that correspond to Big Jerry's appearances in the manuscript, the annotations do something that most footnotes don't do. They say what they don't know. They name the gaps explicitly. They note the hypothesis and tag it as a hypothesis, and leave the question open. This is the correct thing to do. It is what honest research requires. But it is also something else. It is a small act of respect for a man who has never given enough of those. It is the archive saying, in the only language the archive has, "We know you were real. We have not found you yet, but we have not stopped looking." A man rode a white horse across the Dakota Prairie in 1879 and was seen by a girl who remembered him for 60 years. The girl wrote about him in pencil, and the writing survived and reached millions of people, and none of them knew his name. Scholars have been looking for his name for decades, and they have not found it, and they have not stopped looking. Somewhere, the document exists, or the family story exists, or the oral tradition exists, or the church record in Quebec exists, or the probate file in California exists, or the family Bible in a house somewhere in this country exists, with a name written in it that none of the researchers have seen yet. That name is the thing this documentary cannot give you. But the search for it is still open, and the only thing required to keep that search alive is the refusal to accept the nickname as the whole answer. His name was not Big Jerry. We just don't know yet what it was.